Welcome to the AACC Podcast, a podcast of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. My name is Ray Chang, and I have the privilege of serving as the president of AACC, an organization that is seeking to see Asian American Christians established in their spiritual and cultural identities and heritage. I am so glad to be welcoming you to this conversation with really the one and only in my world, and probably in a lot of people's worlds, because I don't know anyone else that has this name, the one and only Pastor Dave Gibbons. Welcome to this conversation.
Woo! Glad to be with you, man.
I'm so thrilled that we can have this discussion. By the way, have you ever looked online to see if there are any other Dave Gibbons out there in the world?
Yeah, man, there's a comic artist named Dave Gibbons, super famous, you know.
He's not that famous. You are the only Dave Gibbons in my world.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you.
Well, I'm so thrilled that we're having this conversation because we're going to be talking about ministry and life in ministry as Asian American Christians. You started New Song 28 years ago?
30 years ago.
30 years ago, okay. So I was just turning 11 years old probably at the time.
You're a baby. You were in the youth group.
Yeah,
you weren't a Christian at that time.
I would have been a child. I would have been the children's ministry at the time. But you started New Song about 30 years ago. It was a majority Asian American church. Tell us a little bit about the church and your ministry experience throughout your life.
Oh, yeah. I grew up in a fundamentalist church. You know, my uncle was an independent Baptist pastor. And I remember the preachers and evangelists that came into this fundamentalist church always talked about hell. And I felt my butt burning, man, every time they started preaching. And then when they had an invitation, I would run down the aisle, man. And then I keep getting saved. I keep going down the aisle because they would say something like, if you have a shadow of a doubt about whether you're saved or not. And I had shadows of doubts all the time because I knew how I thought and how I lived. And so I got saved a ton of times. But I grew up in traditional Christian fundamentalism, evangelical culture, and then I went to the bastions of conservative theology, got involved then later as board members of a seminary here on the West Coast. And then I planted New Song, and New Song started in my apartment after I was in a Korean church for 5 years in the East Coast and for 2 years in Dallas. I launched this church called New Song here, and it just started growing. It was the right time. I think it was just right after the LA riots that they had in '92 that the vision to me was birthed, and the culture was ready, I think, for something that really was a physical expression of reconciliation. Like, could people of different cultures and backgrounds come together? And so the church started growing, and then we started doing multi-sites and social impact work around the world.
And one of the things I really appreciate about your story that I don't know if everybody knows is that as you were going through seminary, you got acquainted with the Korean American church or an immigrant church.
Yeah.
And you were very savvy in how you navigated even the planting of New Song. Can you share a little bit about that?
So my early beginnings in the Korean church were the seminary experience, and then for 2 years I was at this EM. This church would later become the biggest Korean church in Dallas. At that time, it's called KPC of Dallas, but now it's called something else. And then I went to one of the largest Korean mega churches in Maryland. This up-and-coming pastor who was a professor like you, style could teach, but also was fluent in English. And he was someone I felt I could learn from. And he really empowered me. I said, David, I think you're called to reach this generation of young people. So he wanted me to start a church within a church model. So that was really not that advocated for. So my heart enlarged for the Korean church, Korean pastors. I launched a thing with Peter called Catalyst.
Peter Cha.
Peter Cha from Trinity. Yeah. And we were both struggling. We get together and commiserate, about how hard it is to be in Korean churches. And then we found there's a whole group of Korean pastors that were struggling. But then at that time, at the same moment, I don't know if you remember, there's a ton of Koreans filling the seminaries.
Yes.
I mean, that's how the seminaries were making all their money and surviving was the Koreans, man. And so all these Koreans were floodgating the seminaries. And so I felt a lot of connection to this next generation of Korean pastoral leadership. And I understood the struggle I felt because I was living in it. and I was a part of these cutting edge groups. And I think what happened is it just expanded. Like as I was working with these pastors, I saw this vision of, man, how do we do this though and create this expanded vision, but not be seen as rebellious or maverick? Because I had seen some percolations of these new churches that were second-gen churches, and they're really good. I could see what the leaders were trying to do, but many of them were led at that time by like 1.5. And so they had the right heart for the next generation, but the way they were coming off was more of a rejection of their past. And I saw the beauty of it still, being this outsider coming in. I saw still with a new eyes, I think. They were probably wrapped up in the authority combats that they were having with first generation. But I saw the beauty, and I said, how do we keep this so that there's an honoring? And so what I did is when we started New Song, before I even started, I had a lot of the strategic plan that I had written out. I sent it to all my mentors, even Korean pastors, and said, could you give me feedback and let me know what you think? And then once they got feedback, I said, okay, the next step is I'm gonna ask every major Korean leader I know globally, like even if they're not Korean American, but they're Korean mega church leaders in Korea, but everybody would respect them. Anyone I knew, and I knew 3 of the key Korean church leaders that everybody would know that are Korean. And they had become like mentors or friends. I said, hey, listen, I'm gonna be launching this new church for the next generation. I'm not here to rob our current churches of these young people, but I'm gonna try to reach those who are not going to church anymore. Would you bless this? Because I really wanna honor you. I'm not here to disrespect you, but I'm here to honor you. Would you bless this? And it was so good because they gave me the blessing. And so when I came to Orange County, and there was like, who's this new guy in the Bible? You know how a new church, like, the Hillsong or Mosaic comes to the neighborhood, people go, oh no, we're gonna crash. So who's this new up and coming second? So usually there's that normal stuff. But what happened is when they're saying, well, is he really Korean or whatever? Is he against us? Is trying to start something new to grab our people? When I let people know like who blessed us, it's like all the fears and criticism went down. So the Lord, I think, gave us a little bit of perspective on how do you still try to bridge and demonstrate respect and honor the past while building the future.
That's so good. And there's so much there that I think is remarkable because, you know, it's still relevant for my generation and the generations that are emerging. And there's a lot of wisdom there. I remember the first time you told me, which is why I wanted you to share it on the podcast, is like how discerning and wise it was. Where did you get that sensibility to do that, where you went around to ask for not just feedback, but even like their blessing?
Yeah, there's I think a rabbinical quote that just became a part of my psyche. Like I always remember these like little mantras or these design principles. And one quote really resonated with me at the time. It said, those who forget the past are not fit to be pioneers. And I said, man, that's true. You know, really no one does it on their own if they're honest. That there's someone who's gone before them. And it's just with humility, you need to recognize that and honor what's been done before you. And so I felt that was a legitimate honoring and human value that that should be a part of our culture. And so that became a part of how I developed everything that we do is never think that this is all on your own. There's actually someone who's probably gone before you. And then it became true when I started studying missiology and how, you know, you look at the Western church going to Asia and to all these places, they would impose like these forms and practices and rites. It just wouldn't even fit the culture. And that was true when I went to Thailand. So I said, you know, even at that, there's a really, you know, if you come with a really true missiological understanding, you're not bringing Jesus to them. Jesus is already there, man. And there's also something already in the ground that you're called not to like just plant your thing. You're called to help water what's already there. And then I remember my mentor in Thailand, he was considered at the time, Ray, the most significant missionary in Asia. And Fuller gave him that title. And he was called a heretic initially. But he gave me this parable, and I wrote a book on this early on called The Monkey and the Fish. And basically, the parable from Asia was that this monkey was swinging through the jungle and saw this fish like it was struggling in the water. So having empathy and compassion on this fish that was struggling, he dove into the water and pulled it out of the water, and then swung over to dry land, and then put him on the ground and says, "There you go, buddy." And then he with his chest pumped out, he gets back into the trees and starts swinging away like he did something courageous. But the fish died. And we said, that's exactly how we do ministry often. And this idea of honoring what's already there, honor the past, God's already moving, how do you join him in his work?
Yeah. I mean, it does take quite a significant amount of hubris to think that we are going to places where an omnipresent God isn't already working. Totally. That God who is everywhere has never been. And so I love that. I mean, that's beautiful that there is a sense of like honoring the past. Right. You know, but you didn't stay within the Korean immigrant church. You decided to go in towards a more, second gen, multi-ethnic nature. And I think that's a tension and dynamic and dilemma that a lot of people are facing today. Do I stay more kind of ethnic specific, even if it's second gen plus, like primarily English speaking plus? Do I go towards Pan-Asian, or do I go towards the multi-ethnic church? What do you say to people who are in that wrestling? And let me take a moment to say, like, some people will do the multi-ethnic ministry and they'll pursue the multi-ethnic ministry because they truly believe it's God's vision for the church here and now. Other people will say, well, no, the Korean, the Chinese, the Filipino, the Vietnamese, there is a place for that because we live in a society where we are still highly minoritized and marginalized, that there are no other spaces in which our communities are able to convene and gather and to express an indigenous type of faith, even if it's a second generation or second generation plus type of faith. Many Asian American pastors really wrestle with the idea of identifying as an Asian American or as an Asian American church because more than any other group, they want to be maybe validated, accepted by the broader society. And those are all some of the layers that are kind of playing into this. Whereas, like the black church, they have no problem identifying as a black church.
No, not at all.
So, in light of that, like, why a more multi-ethnic expression, which is predominantly Asian? We just said, like, at the beginning, New Song was almost all Asian?
Oh, yeah, it was like 90% plus.
Yeah. And so what would you say to pastors who are in that in that wrestling right now?
It's a great question. I would say you have to discern what your calling is. And so what is that? It's not something abstract necessarily. If you just kind of look at your experience, you look at what energizes you, who do you really feel connected to? It's probably a wiring and a DNA that God's placed within you, these natural impulses and desires. And so for me, I saw it like relegated to a Pauline or Petrine type of calling. Peter was called to work with a Jewish homogeneous group, whereas Paul he could do both. But he was called primarily to reach the Gentiles. And so I said, that's probably our choice today. One's not better than the other. It's really what your unique calling in God's economy looks like for you. So I say it's sometimes very practical, but also something very energizing. And where do you find fulfillment? So I find a need to have all these different types of churches. I don't think we just need one style. You're going to have probably one, it could be extremely like Korean, like totally Korean, and they don't want any Americans culture in it. And then you can have some that are multi-ethnic on this side of the spectrum. But to me, all of it's necessary to reach and to connect with the people in our generation.
That's good. So let's stay on that. So regardless of where you are on the Pauline or Petrine spectrum, if you are an Asian American pastor, there is a propensity through the racialization process to want to distance yourself from your own ethnic and racial identity. Right. Speak into that.
Yeah, I think it depends on what's like. You're right. I think there's second generation young people and pastors probably that don't want anything to do with their Asian American side. So you see this kind of like this racialization, this painting of white over everything, and not really a good wrestling with their ethnic identity. What counters that for me, and the reason why I don't follow that line of thinking absolutely, is because of what I know as the great commandment. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so I find that what compels me to go beyond maybe even my own personal categories is God's heart for the other, for the one you're most uncomfortable with, for the one that's culturally different than you.
For the misfit?
For the misfit. And so, but that doesn't mean that I don't reconcile my own unique identity, nor do I affirm not affirm the identity of a person. It sees that person. I remember there's a Korean young artist that came to the early days of New Song. He was rebellious, he had long hair, so it was like the opposite at that time of what a Korean parent would love. And then he had a hard time with his relationship with his father. But he was all things white, he was all things American, no Korean culture. He hated Korean. And I realized that for him as a Korean American, his other was a Korean. So while we were saying we were a multi-ethnic church, I told my friend, I said, hey bro, when I had a one-on-one discipleship moment with him, I said, your other is actually a Korean. And that's where you're gonna find God. If you can love this person, you're gonna find who God is, because God is often found in the other.
So he needed to almost embrace the radical love of God for him and who he was as a Korean American.
Absolutely, that was his tension. Because he wasn't affirming his identity because I think of his relationship with his dad, which was hard. Yeah. So I think for people, no matter what your natural compulsion or DNA or passion's about, you can argue to follow that, but I think you also have to wrestle at the same time with who is the other in your life.
And sometimes it's yourself.
Yeah, it's yourself.
Wow. Yeah, and I mean, scholars would call that internalized racism, hatred against yourself. But there's so much there that I'd love to pack. But there's another question I want to ask, which is, you're talking about how Asian Americans could fit within the Pauline or Petrine spectrum. But regardless, there are things that are distinct to the Asian American kind of ministry leadership experience that we have to kind of navigate. What are some of the things that you've wrestled with as an Asian American pastor? And I know I'm asking this in part by knowing a little more of your story and knowing that you've kind of like hovered over your Asian American identity and kind of adopted different ways of doing ministry that were maybe not indigenous to being an Asian American. So I don't know if that feels like a accurate statement about you, but also you can't escape the fact that, in the world that you lived in, like you were treated as an Asian American, that you experienced this world as an Asian American and you had to navigate this world as an Asian American. So what are some unique things that Asian American pastors should think about as they, not just as they minister whatever type of congregation that they're in, but as they navigate broader Christianity in the U.S.?
Yeah. I think number one is you're not here to impress anybody. You don't have to impress the critic or impress the one who maybe doesn't see you like you want to be seen. I think if that's the goal, you may never be satisfied, and there's going to be an angst within you. So it won't lead to a very healthy place in ministry. So that's number one. So develop an unoffendable heart. That, no matter whether you get accolades or not, or criticism, it doesn't affect you. It can hurt. You're honest about the reality of pain, but you don't let it settle in your spirit, because you have to learn to hear the voice that's above the din of your surroundings, which takes maturity. It takes time to be weathered through some suffering to probably get to that place. And I would say number two is really think through what are our Asian uniquenesses that American culture maybe needs or the world needs. What is the unique thing we bring from our color and culture of the body of Christ that really contributes to the greater good? And there are really wonderful, unique characteristics. Like for me, I didn't separate my Asianness when I launched New Song. In fact, we were explicit that our first target audience at that time was Asian American. And I was realistic saying it's going to be Korean American because that's who I was connected to, and I felt them. Like I felt like I could breathe with the second generation. I knew how they thought.
New Song Sally.
Yeah, no, I don't know about that. we went away from anything like that. But I think we were really intent on developing a ministry that was rooted in seeing the mosaic of the unique cultures. Like I was really disturbed, and initially all the churches were framing us because they saw us, I think, as a threat initially, as our church was growing more rapidly in terms of mega church environment here than any of the mega churches. And so they would just kind of stereotype, oh, that's just the Asian church, you know.
Oh,
they didn't think they're the Asian mega church, they're the Asian church. So that means if you're Asian, go there, but you probably want to come to our church if you're not Asian. They didn't even read our vision, they didn't know our vision, and they didn't see Asians as diverse. Like, you know, technically, if you're Japanese, Korean, it's like black and white. But they didn't see us as multi-ethnic. They would just stereotype, oh, they're the Asian church. So we were labeled that all throughout our history. New Song is the Asian church. To this day, when people come in New Song today, they can't believe the diversity. But if we were like we were 15 years ago still, they wouldn't still see the diversity. They don't, you know, because they're just looking at color. So that's why you have problems within a lot of the American churches. They're trying to promote diversity when they just see color of skin. Not just, but they'll just look at color of skin as a major determiner of whether they're diverse. They don't look at the culture of an individual. And we know, man, you could be one color, but still be very white in terms of your systemic racism.
That's good. So were there any unique kind of struggles that you had to navigate as an Asian American pastor, as an Asian American ministry leader, especially within the evangelical space?
Yeah, you know, I know we say that, you know, this invisible thing, we're still visible, but invisibility, I still felt invisible. Like I remember thinking, they don't ask us for certain things.
For most things.
Yeah, and it's like we actually probably do better in this arena. And they're just talking to a certain set group of superstars they think in their mind. And so, yeah, I think that's one thing I would say is not really seen by the greater culture, is they have certain mythology around a look, the white knight in shining armor, when actually there's so many people of color that have been doing it long before them. And that's why I realized with the black culture, in fact, because, you know, when people are talking bivocational, for example, it's a common discussion today, but I remember talking about me being a senior advisor, doing marketplace work 15 years ago, and it was like cutting edge, new, and I would quickly say to them, no, the black church has been doing this for a long time. They're still bivocational, and their social impact and community development work is ages, like generations ahead of anything that's a white evangelical or some people of color have experienced. So just honoring that fact, but again, the stereotyping, I think is common, that we have to overcome the way people view us, and they don't even see us. And they don't even mention us in stats. They don't mention us in terms of church growth. Like, for example, when you see a magazine that says 100 fastest growing churches in America, they don't highlight any of the Asian churches, which are the megas, or the black churches, or the Hispanic churches, or the South American or Central American churches. They're not even mentioned. And I go, what the heck? So I think you have to learn how to deal with that stuff.
And I mean, to that point, I mean, what's interesting is that there are several Korean churches that are the largest churches in their predominantly white, historically white denominations. And so, and yet they're often not seen as the church to go visit and learn from, to your point. They're more how did that happen? Which is what I constantly hear, and seen as an anomaly and consistently with what you just shared, like articulated as, oh yeah, it's because all the Asians just go there, or all the Koreans just go there.
You're right. It's not noteworthy.
Yes.
It's like they're not considered the innovators.
Yes.
You know, so when it's like, do you realize what they had to overcome to create?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
In fact, do you realize that they are pioneering, that they had to leave their culture to create this?
Yes. Yeah. No, that's right. Whenever I talk to Asian American pastors who are like comparing sizes, which is interesting talking to you because you're like, well, we were at one point, New Song was at one point the fastest growing church in America, and one of the fastest growing churches. It's one of the largest churches in a land full of very many large churches. Yeah, I always tell them, like, it's so hard to amass Asian Americans into one space, mostly because, we're so busy trying to assimilate into the broader culture that we think being a part of a white congregation will garner us the type of approval that we need. And so even in we're about to release a series of reports where, one of the things that you'll see is that most black people go to black churches, most white people go to white churches, most Latinos go to Latino churches, but most Asians go to white churches or, white-led multi-ethnic churches. Sure. And it's not even by a small amount, it's a significant amount. Like the vast majority of Asian American Christians are that. And so there's something about that I think that's worth unpacking and uncovering. To your point about the invisibility that Asian Americans experience, one of the things I always do when I go to a conference, especially if it's like a multi-ethnic conference or a predominantly white conference, is I look for the Asian Americans because I know that most people are going to ignore them.
Exactly, right.
Because of what you experience and what I experience. Totally, yeah. And what's interesting is a lot of times, unless they know me, it feels like they're waiting for someone else to recognize them. Yeah. Like they're waiting for someone else to talk to them. For sure. And I'm like, you are missing the importance of like what could happen if we like started collaborating in our own spaces. Mm-hmm. So this is so good. One of the questions I have for you is, as you look back on your life in ministry and notice the things that you're noticing now, are there things that you specifically wish that you would have done that you didn't do to cultivate your own Asian American identity, cultivate a community of Asian Americans that validated and reaffirmed your identity? Or would you kind of do it the same way that you did? Because you mentioned that you and Dr. Peter Cha started Catalyst together, and you were on that journey where you were meeting once every a few times a year. And he literally just told me this whole story a couple weeks ago when we were talking on the phone. And like how like rich that was, where I think it was over a decade where you would meet regularly. And I'm like, on the one hand, that's what AACC is trying to like really help cultivate for a lot of Asian American Christians, is this regular convening space, regular gathering, so that Asian American Christians that care about their Asian American identity and their faith can find each other, and especially ones that care about the society and the social realities around them. But it was encouraging to hear that that was something that you had. I'm curious, would you have done anything different? Is there something that you would have done more of? What would you wish for? What do you wish for?
Absolutely. Number one, I've been slower in selection of leaders. There's a quote that says, hire slowly, fire fast. You wonder about the wisdom of that. Where does that come from? Well, when you're an experience in organization or church, you realize over time we make choices out of expedience, or because it may sound effective, or because they have a name value. We often don't really think of the chemistry, the deep character, the spirituality. And so I think I would have done that differently, of how I selected leaders, who I selected to be leaders. I would have been more focused on indigenous leadership versus bringing in the dream team. Not that the dream team wasn't good, but I think if I had a choice now, I would get to know my community well and look for who the leadership is here more, and let that fuel that. I think secondly, I'd be careful about the culture of church, because often if you think you're forward-looking, you're creating the new church for the new generation, it's funny how we're still using Saul's armor and technology. And we know it's clunky, but we don't call it out because your metrics are going to be Saul's metrics.
Butts, baptisms, budgets, and buildings.
Yep, that's it, man. That's the bottom line, and it's a driven culture with a lot of urgency and fear. You're in for survival. You got X amount of time to produce this self-sustaining church. And so I think a lot of that urgency, and by the way, we refused it. We got offers from 2 major denominations, and I said no, because I didn't want to fall to the biddings of a group of people that didn't know us or our vision. And I didn't want that to be the compulsion I had to answer to. I just felt it'd be unhealthy. But it doesn't mean, though, that I didn't yet still adopt some of the cultural values of church planting and how to grow a church. So I would re-examine the way people say to do church, not just wholeheartedly accept that this is how you plant churches, and that the number one way to evangelize the world is church planting. Because even back then, I started to question it when I started seeing a lot of our growth was transfer growth. And to this day, we know that to be true. When, like we found out consultants would say anywhere from 75 to like 85% of the people that these new church plants are getting are transfer growth. So I said, don't start saying and selling your church vision and trying to get donors by saying you're trying to reach the lost of the city. I go, not really. You're just trying to reach those who don't go to church that used to go to church or that are Christians. So yeah, I'd say I would be careful and stay curious about church planting methodology and whether that's even the answer as we know it. Because maybe it's not church planting, I would say it's people planting. That movements are done through usually an individual or through a small group of people. And you don't need the masses, because when you create a mass movement that you think is going to reach masses, you often diffuse things. It doesn't become as concentrated and potent. And also it becomes impossible to maintain. And you're just urgently trying to hustle all the time to have the most massive amount of impact as you can. But again, this harvest component of it, I would tell a young leader, is really up to God. Your call is like we see in Corinthians, like, we plant seeds, we water. We're faithful in that.
God will give the growth.
He gives the increase. You really have to believe that. So the truth is, most people can't scale to a mega church level. Because I tell people it's like a successful company if they're truly honest. There was a study on this on a TED Talk. One of the guys, Bill Gross, I think it was, he talks about their studies of innovative, successful companies. So the number one way to have the greatest impact and be successful wasn't any of those things except one thing. What is it? Timing. From a Christian worldview, God.
Providence.
We stay faithful. We keep planting seeds. God gives the increase. And I think if we tailor our ministry to be customized for the one, and I tell pastors, think of this as the one being your son or daughter. How do you want your son or daughter being treated if they go to a pastor when they're in university, if they're in another setting? How do you want that university pastor to treat your son or daughter? Do you want to see them as a number? Oh, I got to get them to be an usher. I need to tell them their studies aren't important, that church is the most important thing. Or do you want that pastor to really see who they are and tailor a developmental journey for them that really fits the calling that God's given your son or daughter? I said, if you'll think that way, you'll have a very strong, potent, robust ministry. Children, next generation will die to get into that place where you see them instead of trying to use them as a product.
That's good. And I hope everyone hears what you just said. Now, as we round out this conversation, I'm curious, there's a lot that's shifting. There are lots of projections around the disaffiliation of young people. Yeah. We're seeing it within the Asian American Christian world, where in the last 10 years, somewhere between 6 to 10% of Asian American Christians have disaffiliated, or the percentage of Asian Americans have reduced. We are seeing churches closed left and right. We're seeing a number of disillusioned Christians that want to stay close to Jesus, but then don't feel like Jesus is in the church, and so don't know where they can go, flounder around because they don't know who they can trust. To those pastoring in this reality, where young people are finding their preaching more irrelevant, their pastoring more inconsequential, their engagement less compelling, What do you think they need to be thinking about, especially if they're serving the Asian American Christian community?
Oh man, this is one of the most important questions to me, because it's easy to get paralyzed by this daunting, like, catastrophe. It feels like this whole deconstruction of all the institutions, the authority figures that we once admired and really lifted up. They're disappointing us. In fact, we're rejecting even their belief systems. So to me, it's really easy to say there's no hope. But I want to tell people we're in what some sociologists call the fourth turning. You know, there's four turnings. The first turning is typically about the rise of institutions and organization. The second is when they question the institution. The third is like cynicism, and where there's a growing cynicism and anti-institutionalism and individualism as a focus. The fourth turn is what we believe we're in now, is total destruction and chaos. And so people go, well, what the heck, man? It looks so dark. I said, no, it's the prelude to the whole cycle starting again. So it's a prelude to creation, much like we see in Genesis. Everything was void and black and nothingness. And then God declared and created us and the world. So we're in a wonderful moment of opportunity to create again. So if you're creative, if you like innovating and starting something really beautiful, this is our moment. You should get excited about it. And so I really posture our church and our positioning is not a moment of despair, but it's our moment to really be a part of a great, we believe, move of God. Not a move like a crusade where we're trying to impose a warlike attitude towards people, but it's a movement of love. And I tell people, love is our secret weapon. That maybe we could, that's abstract, it's like be gospel-centered. And I said, hey, just don't throw around that word gospel as like this a code word that makes you sound like you're in or you're out. I said, man, the gospel is all about love. There's nothing harder. People go, that's a slippery slope, man, you're being so syrupy. I go, then you don't understand the unconditional love of God. Yes. It required death. It requires a letting go of. It requires a deep faith and a maturity. There's nothing harder than love itself. So I said, hey, this is our moment to create with an attitude and a total character of love. If we'll design our ministries this way, where we love the one and we create, man, watch what will unfold. It's a wonderful moment. And by the way, not forget as you're creating in this moment, the persons that you maybe least think will be leading the way are the ones that God will use. When I was looking at that movie that everybody was excited about, the Jesus Revolution film, there was a mentioning of all the typical heroic figures within Christendom of what was considered the greatest revival in American history. They did mention, and one was highlighted, a guy named Lonnie Frisbee. But they didn't go necessarily into depth who Lonnie Frisbee really is and what he struggled with or who he is. Not necessarily a struggle to some, to others they would say this was his identity. That he was a gay addict. He struggled with drugs. Isn't it crazy to a lot of evangelicals that God would use Lonnie Frisbee, a gay drug addict, who had like this, what some would consider a psychotic episode in the desert where he had visions of God, to lead the greatest revival in American history. So I tell Christian leaders all the time, don't exclude people that you think are the ones that will never come into church or that you can't fully embrace. But if you say you're a church of love, then really love. Be a church of justice, not just in your word, but no glass ceilings.
That's a really powerful story image to really think about and to embrace. Do you have anything specific for the Asian American pastor that might be listening in? That as they're navigating all that's going on.
I would say to the Asian American pastor, you're perfectly wired right now for this moment. Like never have I seen greater favor on Asian Americans. Of course there's like the typical stereotyping, the negative stuff that's going to be constant. but also there's an opening door within our culture where I think there's unique moments that God will lift up different people groups to help define different spheres of society. I think Asian Americans' background, they're perfect third culture people. They've learned how to adapt in multiple ways. And it's like the rise of Korea. It's unusual that a Korea could rise from the rubble that quickly. It's unusual. And then the fervency of the Christian faith that we saw in Korea, which is not as strong anymore, we know. But when you can see that, there's a special favor there that I think that's in this moment for many Asian Americans. Not that there's less favor on others, but there is a unique favor that you've been given, I feel, for this moment, that God can use your voice, your story, your conflict, your struggles, your mental health challenges that I have and we have. He can use all of those unique immigrant traumas that we've experienced in our families for this moment of this diverse catastrophe we feel that we're facing.
I love that, especially because one of the things I'm always telling Asian American leaders is, Asian Americans are uniquely wired not just to bring everyone to the table, but to keep everyone at the table. Yeah. Because we know how to navigate all the dynamics, both from a racialized and racializing perspective, but also because of our kind of disposition towards hospitality. Absolutely. Dave, thank you so much for this time. It's wonderful to be together.
Thanks, man. It's great being with you again, Ray.
Yeah. Well, this has been another episode of the AACC Podcast. I've been so thrilled to have this conversation with Pastor Dave Gibbons. If you find this helpful, make sure that you're connecting with us on social media. Let us know at AA Christ Collab. If you're not connecting with us on our newsletter, make sure you sign up for our newsletter. And if you want to drop a line, let us know how we can continue to serve you. My name is Ray Chang, and I'm the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, and look forward to connecting with you in the future. Thanks for tuning in.